Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Bodine, and I'm a professor here at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And I'm the director of the Innovation Ecosystem component of the Colorado Clinical Translational Sciences Institute. And I am so excited to welcome each of you here today. And I'm even more excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. So Wendi has been kind enough to volunteer at my request to an interview today so we can learn about her journey. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Wendi. She is an amazingly accomplished founder. And hold on one second. I'm sorry, my computer keeps going nuts. There we go. So Wendi is an amazingly accomplished founder and entrepreneur with experience working in both venture and private equity-backed startups, emerging and rapid growth tech companies, and social impact ventures. Most recently, she was a co-founder and CEO and led the strategic vision for a company called Silvernest. She scaled the technology platform, drove nationwide expansion, and created impact-driven housing solutions for the future. She's recognized as a thought leader, pioneering new ideas to enable the rapidly growing aging population to survive and thrive, and many of the financial and social challenges that face those as they age in the 21st century. Silvernest was acquired just in March of 2020 by Finance of America Companies, which is a Blackstone Group portfolio company. And she's currently deciding what to do next. She is an amazing volunteer. She is a board member. She's an advisor and mentor with a passion for social impact and female-led businesses. She's also a seasoned presenter, and Wendi is widely invited to speak on the industry's largest stages and is frequently quoted in the media. And she's been featured on the Today Show, CNBC, NPR, the New York Times, and many other outlets. So I am delighted to welcome Wendi to our Ask the Expert series. And I'm going to start with the classic question, Wendi. Please tell us your story. How did your path lead you to become an unexpected entrepreneur?
Sure. Well, thank you, Kathy, for having me. And, you, of course, are one of my favorite people. And it's a privilege to be here with you today and with this group. So thank you so much. I think if you would have asked me, 30 years ago, and I have to, that sort of is telling of kind of where I'm at on my timeline. If you would have asked me 30 years ago if I would have been an entrepreneur, that thought would have never crossed my mind. And I think, I came out of a family that was first generation in terms of their ability to go to school. My father had been in the military, and then, on the GI Bill was able to come back and go to school. And so my parents were very fierce about a higher level of education, and had one requirement, which was, yes, go to college. But then, they came from an era where it was most common to get a great job with a large corporation. And so my father kind of thought I'd hit my pinnacle in my late 20s, early 30s, when I had a wonderful job working at Motorola and doing some really cool new innovation. And when I informed him that I was going to leave that job to move across the country to Colorado, and then later told him that I was going to leave the big entity to go start dabbling in some private companies and then ultimately startups, I remember he just kept saying, "So why are you doing this? Like, I just don't understand." But I think I feel really lucky because I feel like I've had this opportunity in my career to span both the Fortune 100 and had really great foundational training in those experiences that really helped me move into the startup world. And it was in my first taste of it was really at the end of the 90s. It was when the internet and the .com world was starting to go bananas, the wild, wild west, if you will. And I was able to I was recruited to participate in some new ventures there and kind of got my first taste of it. And that really was, I think, when I became aware of, wow, like I really like operating in an environment where you're really building from the bottom up, and it's not predefined. I liked the ambiguity of that and the fast pace of it. And I had always been in tech. My career was always in tech, but this was a really different flavor. And so I think from that, it was really the jumping point for me to pursue the life in startup. And since then, I've been a part of 4, and I've actually founded 2 from the ground up. And I keep saying I'm not going to do it again, but once it imprints in your DNA, that's
Right.
it tends to kind of pop back up again, right? So yeah, that's sort of my journey, and it's really been incredible. I think I've had great role models and really incredible, super fun opportunities that reinforced that I really enjoy the world of entrepreneurship and startup.
So I'm curious, this is a question I just thought about, but in your years of being an entrepreneur, what individual really impacted you the most? Who was the most influential on your career?
That's such a great question. I will actually say my husband, because so we met in the early 2000s. And I remember when I met him, he at the time was a general contractor and then transitioned into finance. But he'd never actually worked for anyone else. Almost his entire career was being an entrepreneur. And very interestingly, his entire ecosystem of close friends had had that same experience. And, and he was the one that really encouraged me and gave me the support to take the leap and really go out and explore on my own. And he understood kind of that world a lot better than I did, which made it feel a little safer when I was first jumping in.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that makes the difference, having someone that can be a bit of a mentor, right?
Yeah.
So certainly I love mentoring, and I also love being mentored, because I do think that's an opportunity for growth for all of us. It's really, really helpful. So curiosity, what does an entrepreneur do on a daily basis?
Oh boy. I get the easier question to answer would be, what do you not do? Really and truly, right? So depending on the stage that you're at, that can be such a broad range of answers. The earliest days of getting started, it truly is everything in the kitchen sink. I always said it's the very best example of ADD and feeling like you were a master of all and skilled truly in none, because your day can range from anything from you're on the phone with something from legal to I got to go figure out a marketing deal to I've got to figure out how to go get some more cash through the door. I mean, the range is so broad, which can admittedly be really overwhelming. But it's also, I think, part of the crazy that I've learned to really like the variety.
Excellent. Okay. So just for our audience, if you have a question for Wendi, please feel free to put it in the Q&A, and I will weave that into our conversation as we go forward. So Wendi, when you think about, you've worked with my program for quite a while now and gotten to know us pretty well. When you think about faculty, staff, or students who might be interested in entrepreneurship, maybe they think they have a really good idea. What would you advise them to think about first?
So it's interesting because I'm momentarily advising and mentoring, right, a variety of early stage businesses. And one of the first things that I will ask a business is, what do you really want to be, right? So you have a great idea. You may have an idea of how you want to execute that. You may already have thought about a team and putting your team together. But really the path that you choose going forward is largely related to whatever your hopes and dreams and aspirations and visions are for not just next year, but 5 years and 10 years. And I'll give you an example that might be relevant. So when we first built Silver Nest, we knew coming out of the gate that we believed that there was a big enough global problem that we ultimately wanted the business to be a global entity. And we also knew then that that was going to require a certain amount of capital for us to be able to build a company at that scale and to have that type of growth.
Right.
And with that information, it really started to inform every decision that we started to make going forward, right? So before that, we obviously had done our homework to understand the size of the market that we believed that we could serve. And then that really influenced our vision for what we wanted to be. And I point to that because I think, and you and I were talking about this the other day, that we are in an interesting time where I believe that the concept of venture capital and fundraising is perceived really as glamorous and very, if you're successful in raising, then it's sort of designated as success. But not all businesses are intended to be venture, and there are so many other paths. And it's perfectly wonderful for there to be a business that is not venture funded, and still, can be wildly successful from a revenue and an impact perspective. And so I think really understanding at the core who you want to be. We also knew up front that mission and social impact was a very big part of our charter. And so that also played a really important role in the decisions that we made operationally as we were working to put the business together.
So give me a little bit more concrete example of how your mission-driven organization, can you give me an example of a choice or a decision you made? I was just having this conversation in class this morning. So
Yeah. For us, it was aligning with resources that also believed in our mission. And that could be anything from the team that we hired and the folks that we were contracting with to the type of capital actually that we raised. And we knew that, an important part of how we wanted to perform was not just about getting top line revenue, but also demonstrating that we really were helping improve lives. And so we were able then to also establish a set of metrics for ourselves that helped keep us accountable to actually serving that mission and that purpose. And it's not just about the money, it really spans culturally everything that you ultimately decide to do operationally.
Interesting. So, question from the audience: how do you think your tech background helped you, if at all? Was it necessary or helpful?
Yeah, well, I think it was a phenomenal foundation for sure. Now, I am not a coder. I've always been in early stage tech, but on the business side. I think I had the benefit of being able to bring really some cutting edge products to market, both from a product management perspective as well as a marketing perspective. And that definitely helped me understand enough to be dangerous, as I say, or enough to understand how to navigate the design of a team and an architecture and the components of the technology that was critical for us to have in mind. So, for example, when we set out to build, we had a certain set of specs for the technology that were critical. And we were very intentional in making sure that both the decisions that we were making could help us attract the right talent in the future, but also would eliminate the requirement for, a rip and replace and a redo later down the line. And that definitely was the influence of, having had that prior experience. I think it also allowed me to be able to hire well in that capacity. Now, one of the things that I probably would have done earlier is hired a technical co-founder, because I think that really would have served us in a much stronger capacity. But I do think it played a very helpful and important role. And if your solution or your business is organized around technology as a significant component, but it isn't something you're comfortable with, I do really encourage folks to try to bring in complementary talent that has that education and experience.
Okay. So a lot of the conversations I have, particularly with academics, we are brought up in a very different mindset, I think, than, say, a full-bore entrepreneur. Yet, so many of the people that I know that are in academics in one way or another are brilliant innovators. Sometimes they don't even know they're an innovator, and they really, really are. And it's just, I love talking to these folks. But one of the things that I think all new inventors do get stuck on, and particularly when we come out of an academic model where publishing is important and what have you, one of the questions that I get asked fairly often is, how much confidential information should I share when I'm looking for partnership opportunities? You're talking about picking the right partners, but what do you say to them? What can you share?
That is a fine line. So it is the constant balance. And let me apologize to the audience right now, because I have a puppy who is sitting next to me that I'm going to take 1 minute and just release him. So forgive me. So he doesn't disrupt us. So I'm sorry, Kathy. I'll be right back. I'll be right back.
All right. Thank you, Alicia, for that question. That was great. If anyone has any other questions that you'd like me to tee up, please feel free to put those in the chat box, or in the Q&A box. Sorry, I called it the wrong thing.
Okay, thank you. Best laid plans. So it's such a fine balancing act. So one of the things that I hear frequently, I'll take this in sort of different pieces, right? One of the places that people tend to get concerned is when they're first going out and initiating conversations with investors. And one of the common questions is, should I get an NDA? How much should I be able to share? And it's interesting because in the world of venture specifically, it's really unusual and considered sort of taboo to ask for an NDA, because venture has to operate with a certain level of integrity. They know that if ultimately they become deemed as untrustworthy, that it's going to limit them in terms of their deal flow, right? So if the question pops up, particularly around investors, my standard answer on that is, you have to trust going into the conversation that you're comfortable sharing enough information to get them excited, and enough to get a first taste of whether or not they're interested in you. And then, be able to proceed from there, because your relationship with investors really is like a marriage. It really is a level of trust. Now, it's up to you to do your homework and make sure that they aren't invested in competitive products, that there isn't something that you could feel uncomfortable sharing. And usually in a case like that, I will right up front just address that and say, hey, I noticed that you are, investing in XYZ, or you have a partnership with XYZ. So can you please help maybe frame the context of this conversation and your interest related to that particular position that you have? And I think that helps clear the air right out of the gate, and gives you an idea of how far to share, how much to share or not. In respect to just kind of standard partnerships, I think that is perfectly fine for you to actually establish an NDA right out of the gate. So my rule of thumb is, if I'm going into a meeting with a group that I want to partner with, or new collaborators, or even potentially new resources, I'll take a first meeting and have a general level of discussion. And if it's something there where we want to proceed, then we will address an NDA and ask for that in advance of the next meeting. And then I hate to say this because it sounds really loose and kind of nebulous, but I think the reality is that sometimes you have to just trust your gut. Yeah. So there is a certain balance of that, like how little or much do I actually share? But, the reality is that if you have an incredible technology that's going to change the world, and by God, you can get it patented before you have to start exposing it, then that's the ideal state, right? And if you're unable to do that, then you sort of have to walk that balance until you can get to a position. We we were at Silvernest, we were in a position where we didn't have any defensible technology. So we knew that our first to market strategy was going to be really critical. Like moving quickly was going to be really critical to actually establish a defensive position. And so we actually didn't have anything that we would refrain from going into a tremendous amount of details about our strategy for like marketing execution or growth execution. We would keep that confidential unless we were really moving into a next stage with an investor. But the truth of the matter was, we also knew that it was a matter of performance. And that's what really mattered the most.
So how did you find the right people to address the performance aspect? How did you select those people?
Yeah, that's always a little bit of a chicken and an egg, right? So from the earliest days, I was fortunate to have some wonderful early teammates who were part of our founding team. And really for the first year, it was the four of us who were not taking a salary, rolling up our sleeves and jumping in on essentially all of the details. And then as we expanded, which was relatively slow because we were limited by capital in terms of the talent that we could hire, we really focused on trying, at each stage of the business, you have really critical metrics that design the success of that particular stage and enable you to proceed into the next stage. So if we were in our earliest stage and we knew that our goal was to be qualified to fundraise again in 15 months, there were a certain set of metrics and variables that we were operating to within that window of time. And so the talent that we brought in was really important that they could support those specific growth initiatives and those metrics in that moment. Because sometimes if it's too broad and folks can't get down into the weeds, that can be a bit challenging. And so really being disciplined about who we were hiring to actually fit the most immediate needs was terribly, terribly important.
And so let's say you find someone, they meet those needs. Are they done? Do you grow them with what do you do next?
Yeah, well, it depends, right? So when you're looking at your roadmap, you can begin to assess, okay, let's for us as an example with technology, product was king. And therefore the technology was king because the product was a technology offering. So our technical resources had to be effectively 24/7, right? Because in the absence of that, we didn't have a product to offer. But in the earliest days, when we were really just doing early experiments of testing for marketing and awareness, those were really part-time experiments and didn't require us to have somebody that was full-time. And so for those roles, really for the first 2 years, we contracted all of those efforts because we could contract that on a per project basis, having maybe one individual full-time in-house that was helping to manage and monitor that work. But until we really had a requirement for that to be full-time, we did do a lot of outsourcing with folks, and our technical talent actually was outsourced as well. We did use third-party technical contractors in the earliest days to actually support our roadmaps as well.
I think that's interesting, particularly for academics, because we're so trained to think that we have to do it all. And that, how do you let go of that and trust? I mean, how do you make that work for you?
Yeah, well, I think I always say, particularly if you are the founder and CEO or COO, your number one job is to make sure you understand what you're not good at. So, and go find somebody who's a lot better at it than you are. So, in my case, I had an amazing co-founder, and she actually is a financial guru, came out of, finance, data, operations. She loved all the things that I didn't necessarily love in terms of day-to-day operations like HR and legal and finance. And so she said, when she said, I'm here and I want to do these things, I said, I don't think I could love you anymore. And really, she became my right arm. We really were the yin and yang of each other for 6 years. I think that, assessing, the strengths and weaknesses on your team are critical. And I also, kind of going back to what I said a moment ago, having, in the earliest days, I really think having skilled resources that are addressing a function versus, being a general player can be really helpful, because, you tend to have a lot of things that have to get done, but having folks that really understand specific lanes or specific functions is an incredible value, because in the earliest days, you don't have a lot of time to teach people or to have people have time to go, gosh, I don't know how to do this. Let me go. They may be wonderful operators, wonderful resources, but they may not have a depth of expertise in something like growth marketing, as an example, right? And if you have to move very quickly, there is a benefit in having folks that have a depth of expertise in the specific functional areas that you don't yet have on the team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So thinking back on some of these crazy things you've done, think about maybe when a partnership failed, and can you talk a little bit about why partnerships might fail?
Well, they come in all different shapes and forms and sizes, right? And so I think the very first one, most importantly, is if you are going to have a founding team or a co-founder in your business, I strongly encourage you to go through the practice of designing your operating agreement together and really asking the tough questions. And oftentimes when we are founding a company or we're coming together around an exciting idea, it's really fun if by chance you found that the yin to your yang, right? And they have the complementary skill. You're like, yay, we've got this great idea. We have this wonderful talent, and okay, let's just go do this. But, inevitably, what happens 2 or 3 or 4 years from now really can, it can have a number of considerations, conversations, and issues that are related to how you might set your foundation up at the very beginning. So, for example, having a really candid and difficult, it's sort of like if anyone has done a will or a trust, the pain of, you're like, oh, I don't want to talk about these things now because I'm excited and I want to go have fun. Right. But having a dialogue with somebody as a co-founder around things like, what if one of us dies? What if somebody gets divorced? What is your dream for an exit, or what do you want to have happen at the end, right? Maybe one of the founders doesn't want to exit. They're dreaming that this is something that they do for the next 20 years. Maybe somebody says, my bottom line number is 5 million. And the other person says, well, mine is 50, right? And having an opportunity to go through that alignment very early on is critical, because when the time comes in the future to address any of those issues, God forbid, good and bad, you don't want to be surprised and find out that you're dynamically different at that point, right? And I think as a principle that probably just applies in general to all of relationships, without, certain versions of partnerships have a different requirement of vetting. So founders being really critical, investors being really critical. But, even if you're going to do a distribution partnership, right? Understanding what's important to that partner.
So explain what a distribution partnership is.
Sure. So let's say you have a fantastic new piece of hardware. You've got a patent on it. Maybe it's addressing the longevity market, and you're ready to get out and start doing sales. A distribution partner is someone that you might team up with to actually help bring your product to market and selling through their existing channels to help you go get new users and new customers. So Amazon could actually be defined as a distribution partner in some senses today.
Yeah, interesting. So sometimes when you're doing a startup, you don't have maybe very much money or maybe not a lot there just yet. So when you think about equity and giving up equity, why would you do that? And what's the benefit of giving up equity? And what does that mean? To give up
Great question. This is a great question. So I see so much anxiety or tension around equity. And equity is really, it's a pretty simple conversation, honestly, right? So equity is who owns the company and what does that allow me to recognize as a reward later, right? So when we create value for the business, presumably I'm going to get some type of return, either in the form of a distribution or, at a liquidity event, some type of payout. And interestingly enough, so let's take the example of two founders creating a brand new company in its earliest stages. Depending on what the founders have agreed to, you can design the company in ownership and say, Kathy, you own 50% and I own 50%. And we're both coming to the table equally, and we're both bringing whatever agreed upon dollars in or agreed upon sweat equity. And so we therefore have agreed that each of us are, receiving a value of 50% of the company. It could be that you, Kathy, have had this idea for a long time. You're going to put in $300,000. You may have a co-founder who's coming with wonderful value, but hasn't come in quite as early and isn't contributing the dollars. And so maybe for that, it might be a 90-10% split, right? Those are decisions that you make at the very beginning. As you start to advance in the business, as you're bringing on new team members, I always say the senior level, earliest stage team members, we tend to offer them positions with a percentage of equity as a component of their compensation packages. And a lot of times what you're doing in early stage is that you're using equity to offset what you're not able to pay from a market value perspective in compensation. So if, let's say, if I were going to hire you, your market value is $150,000 as a, senior level, C-level person. But today I have limited capital, and so maybe I can only technically afford to pay you $50,000, right? So what I'm going to do then is prepare a package that has equity that's commensurate with your role, your experience, your contribution, and then also to take into consideration what the market value of your compensation would be. Now, going forward, typically as you start to expand, you're going to have what we call, you're going to set aside. So again, Kathy and Wendi have 50 and 50. We're going to carve out now a percentage of equity that we're going to put on the side for employee stock options. So in the future, as we're hiring, so let's say we're going to put 20% aside so that in the future, as we're hiring new folks, we can allocate out of that pool. You and I then have just diminished to a 40-40. We've got a 20% available to be able to allocate out on an as-needed basis for new hires. And that's a pretty common consideration. And if you have investors, they're always going to want to know that you have a pool set aside to be able to attract the right talent.
Right.
One of the places that I hear people get very anxious about equity is, oh my gosh, well, now I'm giving up, for this investor, I have to give up 25%, or for this, situation, I have to give up X percent. And what I will tell people is the percent is really, there are anticipated percentages that when you're fundraising at different stages that you are likely going to have to negotiate and allowed to be purchased in at, right?
Right.
But that's also assuming that if you and I start out at the beginning and it's just us and we're 50-50, and, the company's brand new and we say, oh, if today we sold this concept on the market, maybe we'd get $1 million for it or $2 million, right? The value of our 50-50 is half and half, right? Maybe it's $500,000, $500,000. If I sell 25% of my company to investors, but now I'm saying that the value of that company is worth $10 million and I've sold them 25% of it, well, then obviously the balance is now what you and I have 50-50. So our value has gone up. Our percentages have gone down, but the value per unit of the shares that we own have actually gone up. So I will tell people that feel concerned about the dilution or having to give up a percentage. Would you rather have 100% or 50% of a $200,000 company, or would you rather have 25% of a $200 million company? Because in theory, if you're selling equity in the future, it's because the valuation of your company is going up. And for folks who are not kind of founders or at a senior level, we usually will allocate equity in units for that reason. Let's say maybe you're getting 25,000 units at a value of X, and then they can monitor how that goes up over time because the units never change. The percentages will always change based on future rounds of funding, et cetera. But the quantity of units that you own will never change.
It's always interesting, I think, because again, if you've grown up in an academic field or medical, like an MD or a nurse or whatever, we don't typically take business classes. And yet there are such great entrepreneurs within these ranks. But sometimes we don't even understand the language. We have to learn. It's not that we can't, it's that we have to learn it. And sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And so I think, a lot of these questions that seem so logical, when you're out at a like Denver startup, you're hearing people talk all over the place about this, that, and the other thing, and you realize how our vocabulary is so much different, and so
okay, it's different for a lot of people though. So I will say that. So I would say, I think even for me, when I first started to enter into, discussions like we just had around equity and cap tables and et cetera, that felt really intimidating, right? Because it wasn't something that I was familiar with outside of, I worked at Motorola and they gave me some options, right? I understood that much, but the design of a cap table and how that actually worked. And, there was a lot that I just didn't know until I actually went through the experience. And, I will tell you that I think some of the best things that you can do for yourself very early on, get a wonderful lawyer who is extremely seasoned in startup. That is one of the very best investments that you will make for the duration of the company, because you'll be surprised how many of the how many mistakes I've seen in terms of legal documents in its earliest formation. And sometimes we actually had to fire a team early on because there was one word in the documents that was wrong, but it was extremely material. It would have come back to bite us in the butt pretty hard 2 or 3 years later when we were at an advanced stage of funding. And so having the right legal counsel up front to help establish things like your equity, your cap tables, your docs, all of that stuff is so important. And also having a really good financial resource who understands what I call cap table math is also worth its weight in gold right out of the gate.
And what is that?
What is what? I'm sorry.
Cap table math.
Oh, cap table math. Well, so when we were just talking about the 50-50% example, that's basically cap table math, but it gets more complex. So because when you're looking at your cap table in the beginning, like the capital table, meaning who owns what percentage of capital, right? If I have, again, 100% of the company's ownership is now divided into 2 shareholders, Wendi and Kathy, And then Wendy and Kathy say, well, we're gonna take 20% and set it over here for our employees. Okay, now my cap table says I have Wendy, Kathy, and employee shareholders. Oh, and now we hire, a new executive, and we're going to give that person 10%. Oh, now they're on the cap table. And now I'm going out to fundraise and I'm raising money and we're selling 25% ownership. Oh, that goes on the cap table. And each time you make those additions, right, and each time that there's a new allocation given in any form, it impacts your cap table, right? The lines change, the percentages change. And as you start to look forward and say, well, gosh, in 3 years, I think we'll probably be raising a $40 million round, right? If you design your cap table math and your cap table model, you should be able to project forward in such a way that you can actually determine, well, gosh, then at 3 years, gosh, Kathy, how much do you and I still hold if we've raised money and we've done all these things hypothetically? Like at that position, what's still our percentage of ownership, right? And what does that look like? And so it sounds, I know, overwhelming if it's not familiar, but trust me, if you have a good financial person, they can do this stuff with their eyes closed. I was, again, very fortunate that I had a co-founder who, she can run circles around this. And once you've done it once, it's not as scary as it might sound. Exactly. But again, if you don't know it, then by all means, get the right people who really do understand how to do it.
Yeah.
It's game changing. It's game changing. I've seen situations where people have phenomenal businesses and concepts and they're out fundraising and they get disqualified because the cap table was really funky for some reason. Like maybe they gave away too much that they shouldn't have given away, or there wasn't enough left, right, to be able to give to the investors. And so there's just, a lot to consider there. And it's easy to get a lot of opinions and potentially make a mistake if you don't have the right guidance.
Agreed. So here's a question from the audience. What advice would you give yourself when you first started? I love that question.
Well, get the right lawyer, get the right financial resource, most important. Get the right operating agreement in place. Be aware of what you don't know and go find the very best resources that you can afford to support you, and don't be scared to do that. Mm-hmm. If you're considering bringing somebody in at a higher level, I recommend doing, initial trials. Like, hey, let's do a 90-day trial and see if we like each other, like dating first before marriage. Mm-hmm. I think deciding the amounts of capital that you do or do not want to raise and why is so important right at the very beginning. Sure. And I think from a lifestyle perspective, being really deeply honest about what is most comfortable for you, right? So the world of startup and entrepreneurship is not for everybody. And there are days I tell myself, like, I am never doing it again, because the highs are high and the lows are low, and you can have them to that extreme within an hour on any given day, right? And there are really important questions around, is it a venture-based operation or is it a lifestyle business? Because those operate really differently. And taking into consideration, your financial runway, impact on family and personal time, all of those things I think are really, really important to think about in terms of the commitment that you want to make.
Is the another question, is the operation agreement the same with the founder agreement?
Yes, in its earliest stages. So your operating agreement is basically just it is the formal filing and guidelines of the business, and it captures some of the key, like how you're going to work, how the business is going to proceed, some of the key guidelines for the operations of the business early on. When you get to when you go to get formal investment and you have new investors coming in and you actually start to have a board, you will have a different operating agreement that is a board-led operating agreement that now may have new kind of quote rules of engagement for the business operations.
Interesting, interesting. So one of the things that you and I have talked about, and I think this is such a critical question and so hard to do well. But the question is, how do you determine who or what partnerships to pursue? And how do you make those decisions from a business perspective rather than a personal perspective? Or is there a combination built in there somehow?
Yeah, good question. This again, I know I sound a little like a broken record, but so much of it depends on the version of yourself that you're going to want to be in 3 to 5 years or beyond. And so, partnerships they include everything from who do I want to have as a founding partner to who do I want to have as an investor partner to who do we want to have as a potential sales partner, right? And somebody that could be reselling our products and services or that we're selling them into from a contract perspective. And I think it's interesting because in the earliest days, you get so excited when you're like, yay, like we've got one and this is so cool. And then what happens is if something is going really well, then inevitably you kind of evolve into a next position where suddenly like you start to have more choices. And that's when things get kind of tough because then, I say you have to be very deliberate and intentional to ensure you don't get caught up in, we used to call it squirrel syndrome, squirrel, shiny object syndrome, right? And consistently rooting yourself back in the goals, right? Both from a quantifiable metrics perspective, as well as an aspirational perspective it's fundamentally important to help keep on track. One of the things that this happens for everybody, like you'll end up hitting kind of this fork or this pivot where suddenly there will be all of these different exciting opportunities. And you suddenly are faced with, well, wow, I want to do all 5, but you may not have the resources to do all 5. And so figuring out the ones that are going to actually have the most return and impact, to meet the goals and to actually accelerate or propel you forward becomes really important. Because you want to make sure that you're not spending too much time on the things that ultimately aren't going to return. And it sounds really simple and logical to say that, but you'd be very shocked and surprised at how easy it is for all of us, myself included, to kind of get caught up in the squirrel syndrome.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think about it, from a just sticking with CU and shoots for a bit. Our goal at the end of the day, no matter what, is to impact patient health in some way so that their health outcomes are improved, maintained, something, right? And translating that goal, if you have an idea for a product here at CU, into a business model can sometimes seem very awkward, like I'm putting dollars on this, wait a minute, so it can be really challenging. And so if you're that person, you really you're driven to improve the lives of your patients and you've got a great idea. How do you take that emotion out of it? How do you let go, if you will? I'm not sure if I have the right words.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can give you some really specific examples as it related to our most recent ventures. So let me start by saying that I am a big fan of conscious capitalism. It was something that I got introduced to back in 2012 and 13. John Mackey, who founded Whole Foods, was actually the father of conscious capitalism. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that many of some of the leading larger brands that operate today actually operate on the principle of conscious capitalism. So Starbucks, Costco, the Container Store, to name a few, Whole Foods, obviously. And what that really suggests is that you can do good and make money at the same time. And the key to being able to do that is taking into consideration all of the stakeholders, which includes the environment and the earth. It includes your employees and your team. It includes the shareholders, certainly, right? But it isn't just uniquely about the revenue itself. So one of the things that it's interesting, because when we first came into being and we were focused on the aging and longevity market, we bumped into a really strong resistance from many people who were operating in the world of nonprofit, because we were focused on helping a population that was vulnerable, 50 plus, and we were addressing an area that made them even further vulnerable, their housing. Right. And so we had many organizations that said to us, well, it just feels like you're taking advantage or you're monetizing off of a vulnerable population. And what we believed firmly was that the solution really needed to exist, and there were many people that needed to be served by it. And in order to get to the scale that we needed to get to, it required us to be a for-profit so that we could expand and grow much more quickly. Because, as you'll know, the process of being a nonprofit and consistently searching for funding, right, and trying to design your revenue streams can be very challenging. Now, if you're really well established and the profit and revenue is not critical to scale and growth, then that's perhaps a different path. But we were entering new territory that had largely been served in the nonprofit, from the nonprofit perspective. And I think really pausing to be able to educate our audiences about, why it was important for us to be able to monetize and how that allowed us to serve more people was an important part of our journey.
That's interesting. And I think that's something that you have to really be thoughtful about in order to be successful.
Yeah.
Our time is getting short. So I think if I were to ask you one last question, is for the folks that are here today that maybe are interested in launching a startup, what would be any other advice that you might give?
Yeah. So, well, for those of you that are in, Colorado specifically, you're in a wonderful ecosystem that has many available resources to learn from, right? We have Startup Week in Denver. We have, Techstars based up in Boulder. We have just so many wonderful, free resources that you can use to educate yourself and really get exposed to some of the things that are important. I always encourage folks to find a mentor, find an advisor, find somebody who's been on the journey before, and don't let them out of your clutches. Go get them and learn from their experiences. Because sometimes you can have all of the best laid plans and you can do all of the best work. And you're still not going to have the absolute answer until you just get in and you do it. And so immersing in as many places as possible and learning and taking advantage of those resources, I think is really important.
I agree. And for those of you from CU and CSU, if you're on today, and really anywhere, any university in Colorado, as part of the CCTSI, the Colorado Clinical Translational Sciences Institute, we have a ton of help for you. And we're all eager to connect you to the right people in the right places. And I know my colleague Sarah at CSU is certainly willing to help, and our friends at Boulder as well. So I think Wendi, thank you. I mean, truly, this is a great, fun conversation. I, of course, expect to have many, many more of these with you because there's so much to learn. And I think there's so many ways of doing business that sometimes we don't realize exist. And I think that that's one of the things that you're very good at is helping folks to be more thoughtful and planful around their endeavors. So thank you so much today
You're
for taking
welcome.
time with us. And we
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would just say, and don't be scared. You
Mhm.
know, if you have something that needs to be in the world, like go try, go try it.
That's right. All right. And we have a thank you from the panelists. Let me just check one last time. You are welcome. All right. So thank you all. We'll be back again this time next month, and we'll have lots more fun things to talk about. So thank you, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Wendi, so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.